But wait, you may be asking, isn't this video supposed to be the one you said would be the one after the next one and the last one? Well, yes, but it's been like 2 weeks. I'm waiting on both of my OSTs to still even ship, let alone arrive, and it seems like the information included in it is going to be more of a neat trivia thing than a big lore bomb thing, so there's no disadvantage to doing this now, especially since it'll keep me from getting punched in the face too hard by the algorithm while I'm waiting for my products that were supposed to ship 3 weeks ago to, actually do that. Regardless of the topic though, this video will still contain spoilers for the entire numbered Xenoblade Chronicles trilogy. Anyway, today we're going to talk about how cool Future Redeemed is again, but I will also be inadvertently placating a small but very vocal group of people who like pressing the thumbs down button on all of my content, because I will be saying nothing but good things about Xenoblade 1 for the rest of the runtime of this video. Basically, in addition to all the other cool things it manages to pull off, Future Redeemed also makes Xenoblade 1 better in retrospect in 3 different ways. Firstly, and most simply, it treats Xenoblade 1 with a ton of respect and admiration, ending out the Klaus saga while paying massive amounts of tribute to the game that started it all. Secondly, it rebalances the amount of fan service present in the full package of Xenoblade 3, making for a much more even mix of stuff from both 1 and 2, as opposed to prior to Wave 4 where it was heavily skewed towards 2. And then lastly, it raises the importance of Xenoblade 1 to the overall narrative of the series, while also introducing new paths for the continuity to go down, ensuring that despite its humble beginnings as a new IP unconnected to any of the creator's previous work, Xenoblade 1 has earned its place as a Xenogame. Beyond the stuff I talk about reinforcing at least one of those 3 points, there's not really going to be a structure to this. I'm just going to talk about cool things in the DLC related to Xenoblade 1. One thing I do think is relatively easy to miss because it is admittedly kind of semantics based, is the composition of your party. Ignoring Nael, there are 6 members of the Future Redeemed party. 2 of them are the protagonists of the 2 games whose worlds were combined to make Xenoblade 3. So that is 1 direct representative of each of Xenoblade 1 and 2. Then we have Glimmer and Nikal, 1 each a child of each of those previous 2 characters. But despite Shulk and Rex having kids being easy to extrapolate from the endings of 1 and 2, these children did not exist as characters until Xenoblade 3. So while you could argue that this is also indirectly 1 representative each of 1 and 2, I would argue that since these are original characters to 3, and soldiers in the Ionios Flame Clock system who get freed and become Ouroboros, this is 2 representatives for Xenoblade 3. And then there's Matthew. Yeah, he's a descendant of 2 Xenoblade 3 original characters, but he also fights exactly like Faye. He's effectively a Xenogears representative, and not from any of the games in this trilogy. And then we get to A. Is A an original character to 3? No! A is, for all intents and purposes, Alvis from Xenoblade 1. That is another direct representative of Xenoblade 1. So, out of Future Redeemed's party, Xenoblade 2 gets 1 representative, Xenogears gets 1 representative, Xenoblade 3, the game it is a DLC of, gets 2 representatives, and then Xenoblade 1 also gets 2. More emphasis is being placed on 1, just from the characters you're allowed to control. Then, and this is way more concrete, consider the Cent Omnia region itself. The main theme of the area does have a musical nod to Gower Plain in it, and that's neat and all, but think of how many Xenoblade 1 areas are represented in there. Obviously there's a ton of Bionis Leg in there, but there are also elements drawn in from Tephra Cave, Satoral Marsh, Machina Forest, Valak Mountain, Prison Island, even Bionis Shoulder from Future Connected, not to mention the entirety of the old town of Colony 9 still being present. Xenoblade 2, on the other hand, gets a ton of Tantal and then 1 island from the Cliffs of Moritha. In addition to just lending to the whole circular feeling for the entire trilogy that Future Redeemed aims for, I think this is also pretty justified, given how the majority of Etia is Gormott and not Bionis Leg, and how Keves Castle region, despite being the seat of power of Keves, is more Ardain, and just generally how there are a few more Xenoblade 2 locations referenced, and specific landmarks brought over compared to Xenoblade 1. I know the Mechanis' sword is like the big goal for half of the game, but even then, Araya is also on the box art, it's also iconic in the Ionia skyline. I think it's a bigger explorable area, and also just a more interesting set piece as a gameplay thing compared to the sword, which, by the way, the city isn't even permanently located there in the first place. I do think that there's probably a technical reason for it too. Like, even with Definitive Edition's improvements, Xenoblade 2 assets are probably better looking and a bit easier to translate into Xenoblade 3 than stuff from 1 is. In spite of that though, Bionis definitely deserved some love, and it received it. The DLC even uses its callbacks to those locations particularly well. Just think of the multiple unique monsters with similar names in the exact same place as the original versions in Xenoblade 1 were. Or all the small location discussions where Shulk reminisces about something. Or the fact that the story climax involves visiting Prison Island on your way to fight a false god using the power of the Ontos Core, again, is actually an intentional plan by the villain to mess with Shulk. And even the view of Jupiter in the post-credit scene is very, very similar to an angle you can get in Xenoblade 1. In addition to the obvious Shulk and Rex team up, and even Shulk, Rex, and Noah if you count N in the final boss fight, we also get a ton of Shulk and effectively Alvis teaming up, except this time Alvis is the one using the Monado, and Shulk is using a weapon of his own creation. A has Alvis's 2 arts from the one fight where he was a guest in Xenoblade 1, as well as visions with a different mechanic but the same level of brokenness and the original sound effects. And while yes, Rex does use animations from 3 of his party members, Shulk turned his Monado Buster into Blossom Dance, which is kind of inarguably the coolest piece of asset reuse in the entire series. Then there's Colony 9 itself. Always a bastion of resistance in any era, even here in Ionios when half the buildings are too decrepit to even be safe to live in anymore. And yet, it's not just the buildings. While the explanation of people who weren't assimilated into Origin is given to Linka, it is ultimately Xenoblade 1 that reaps the most from this, as we don't just get Shulk and Panacea there directly, but we also get to meet Georgie, the granddaughter of Giorgio, a curry salesman from the original Colony 9 in the original game, and Riku too is elevated to the level of person from one of the original worlds related to a previous character who was brought into Ionios intact. Not only that, but they canonize several Colony 9 related side quests from Xenoblade 1, either via someone directly referencing it or Shulk reminiscing on it. Like, who would have ever possibly thought that the words Gem Man in that order, with nothing in between them, would ever be directly uttered again in a Xenoblade game after 1? That was amazing. And then, they even managed to take a controversial aspect of the first game, the generic side quests, and make it a cool throwback that I was legitimately nostalgic for. Like, yeah, 3 sets of 3 generic quests, especially when the first one in the first set is a direct redo of a previous quest from the original game, that's perfect. Honestly, I wouldn't have minded more of the generic quests in Future Redeemed, just because the progression system is so good that you advance your character no matter what by doing literally anything in the game. And while we have Riku on the mind, yeah, it's incredible the way they gave the explanation for who he actually is, and it didn't only help him make more sense, it gave more to Ricky, just like Future Connected did with Kino and Nene, but it also gave a ton more to Melia, which is especially important because of the 2 queens, Nia definitely got it way better in the main game, so even though she doesn't physically appear, Melia's character gets expanded on in the DLC. Then there's the fact that Ricky's son or grandson, depending on what you believe, who was rendered immortal by the random machinations of Origin, now holes up in what's left of Dunban's house, and because Shulk is married to Fiora and Ricky offered to adopt Shulk, he is basically staying over with a relative because his own home was probably destroyed in whatever caused Mac the Wildwood to come into existence. That's great. And then, Riku not only implies that there might be the souls of people important to Shulk in his replica Monado blade, which That's already super interesting because that implies it contains Origin Metal, something the Future Connected version clearly didn't because Origin didn't exist at the time. But then, the implication that Lucky 7 got its name because it holds the souls of 7 people important to Melia. We can argue a lot about the identity of those 7 people, and I am about to do that, because the most obvious thing is, okay, there were 7 party members in Xenoblade 1. We know Shulk and Melia are still alive in Ionios, so just remove them from that list and add Kino and Nene in from Future Connected. Boom, that makes sense. Okay, but there's the weird tomb thing for Ricky in Mac the Wildwood in the main game. Does that mean that Ricky was avatared into Ionios and then killed? Remember, he will still be brought back as normal at the end of that. That doesn't mean he's gone for good. Okay, that gets rid of 1. So then you have to put Tyrea in there. But then there's also Teal'c, and that's a little weird. Why would she put one of her siblings in there and not her other one? Well, the exact scene has Riku looking at the wrapped up Lucky 7, saying, "Everyone is right here," and then looking at Shulk's weapon and saying, "and also with Shulk there." So either the souls are kind of drifting, that was not intentional actually, in between the 2 weapons and can kind of come and go as they please, or Shulk has some people with him and Lucky 7 has some other people in it. If this is Shulk, then clearly Fiora will be in his weapon and not Lucky 7, because I'm pretty sure she's closer to Shulk than Melia. And then maybe also Ryan and Dunban. And if you have the idea that Shulk can have some of the Xenoblade 1 cast, and the people in Lucky 7 are specifically people close to Melia, then it's actually fairly easy to make a list of 7 other people who would only be in Lucky 7. Now, granted, it is a little weird to suggest that some of Noah's power is coming from, like, Nene and Teal'c, and not people like Ryan and Dunban, but the entire deal with that is, it's a Melia-specific thing, so as long as the stuff makes sense for Melia, it still holds up in my book. But the other important thing is, we didn't know that pieces of Origin Metal detached from Origin could hold people's souls until Future Redeemed. And while they draw power from Ouroboros stones, the main game's party only has Noah's Lucky 7 when it comes to Origin Metal until they get the very late game upgrade to their main class's blades. Which means the Xenoblade 3 party is explicitly drawing power from Xenoblade 1 characters, but we don't actually know whether or not they're doing it with Xenoblade 2 ones. The very easy argument is that Xenoblade 2 characters are in the Ouroboros stones because those are the things that Nia had a role in, but we don't have any explicit confirmation of that. And that's a massive reversal to the amount of things we got explicit confirmations about related to Xenoblade 2 in the base game, compared to the Xenoblade 1 stuff being ambiguous even by Xenoblade 3 standards. What is decidedly not ambiguous if you're in the know is the fact that Future Redeemed is trying to make the series go full circle in a way that the base game of 3 really did not, and obviously all the Xenoblade 1 nostalgia plays a big part in that. But I think a very important aspect of it is the music. Cresting the hill into Yesterdale would have been a peak experience for longtime fans no matter what played there, but the fact that they went so far as to play, admittedly the definitive edition versions, of Colony 9 and Time to Fight just shows that they wanted this to be an event, in a way, for longtime fans. Someone who had just played 3 and was going into Future Redeemed after that wouldn't even know that those 2 songs were from a previous game, because they're Xenoblade songs. They're going to sound like the other Xenoblade songs they've been hearing throughout the entirety of the base game and Future Redeemed up to that point. But those who know would know, and it's the kind of vibe that you only really get to this degree 2 other times in the entirety of Xenoblade 3. Now, there are plenty of songs that reuse leitmotifs overall from 1 and 2, and obviously a lot of theming around the Queen's music is reused from their respective games, but that stuff is changed up a lot more than the kind of thing I'm talking about, because obviously we're comparing it to literally reusing songs directly from Definitive Edition. The only 2 things to that degree that I would consider are Alace Highway, which is a largely optional area that I don't think gets nearly as much attention for the amount of Xenoblade 1 stuff they crammed in there, and of course the fact they went this far with the music, despite the entire Distant Fingertip being completely intact. And then Ino's quest playing Xenoblade 2's battle theme, which is part of the DLC, and part of the DLC's Xenoblade 2 fanservice problem. I'll admit this might just be a me thing, but while I don't really care either way about Time to Fight, the opening guitar section of Colony 9 elicits such a nostalgic, wistful feeling for me that I can't really put into words at all. And the fact that they stuck that in their thing that's supposed to be seeing you off and pointing us towards a new future, as is the Japanese name of the expansion, just speaks to something very profound with what they wanted to do with this game. It seems like they had 3 goals here. The first 2 were the ones they outright stated. Show us a bit about the future, expand more on the world of Xenoblade 3 and tell us a prequel, and then also remind us why Xenoblade 1 deserves the Xeno in its title. I would genuinely go as far to say that 3 did a bad job of that until Future Redeemed came out. 1 and 2 got roughly equal billing when it came to amount of things carried over into Ionios in base game 3, I will give you that much. However, there was just this kind of stigma overlying the entire thing that, despite the way they did the combat and the way they did overworld stuff and exploration being a bit closer to 1 than just a 2 sequel, there was just more 2 stuff around. We didn't really know what Xenoblade 1 actually brought to Origin other than building half of it, because Tora came from 2. The core crystal technology that we could see there came from 2. Maybe the metal came from Mechon armor, but that's not even confirmed as of now, so it kind of seems like the best minds of Bionis and Mechonis were left just following Tora's blueprints. Then there was the fact that Melia got a reminiscent scene about things that had happened in the past with her party members, while the Xenoblade 2 party got the photo showing a little bit about what happened to them in the future. And we were all making jokes about the founders and how most of them were connected to Rex in some way. So even when we were discussing the idea of a founders prequel for the DLC campaign long before we knew what Future Redeemed would be, the idea was that it would still be just a lot of Xenoblade 2 stuff. And then the expansion pass started coming out, and most of the content was more Xenoblade 2 stuff. While the Land of Challenge related stuff is as balanced between Xenoblade 1 and 2 as the rest of the game is, because it's mostly just stuff pulled from the rest of the game, and admittedly, in English at least, the Archsage is voiced by someone from Xenoblade 1, the 2 new heroes were just completely Xenoblade 2 stuff. Ino's entire shtick was fanservice for the artificial blade stuff, and she potentially came with even more information about what Tora was up to following the end of Xenoblade 2. After that, we were all thinking, okay, obviously, the second DLC hero is going to have a Kavesi class, and it seems like they're going to be from the city, so they'll obviously be from one of the Kavesi houses, and we'll learn a bit more about Xenoblade 1 stuff. Then, no. Masha plays like a Kavesi for just role balancing purposes, but she's one of the Agnian houses, and after seeing Linka in Future Redeemed, we know that she's directly descended from 2 party members from Xenoblade 2, and her house has a tradition very heavily based in the beliefs of not only those party members, but also, say it with me again, Rex. That's already enough to be off-putting to someone who preferred Xenoblade 1, but then you also have to bring in the context of the big piece of baggage that I thought 1 would always have to deal with as long as this continuity of Xeno lasted. And that is, it would always have to follow up on the debt of never having been intended to be a Xeno game in the first place. Which means, while it carries a ton of hallmarks of Gears, Saga, and later Blade games, it is missing a few essential Xeno elements that were retconned into the series and brought into continuity with 1 starting with 2. Now, I'm not saying that 1 doesn't feel like a Xeno game at all. It still has most of the hallmarks. The power of friendship is there, giant robots are there, organized religion ends up being a bad thing, and someone gets crucified. But I would definitely still refer to it as the least Xeno game, and a lot of people were thinking that if they continued some sort of overarching lore in the series past 3, Xenoblade 1 would just keep becoming less and less relevant because it lacked some of those elements, and that would cause its importance to the series to fall to the wayside, despite the fact that it was the one that started it all, and if you've been around for longer than 13 years, saved it all. Let me be clear in no uncertain terms. Xenoblade 1 being renamed to Xenoblade from Another Beginning of the World, and ending up being a good and successful game, is the only reason there is still a Xeno series in 2023. It's also the reason we have a Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. I will actually always say that, as of now, despite 2 being the most successful, 1 being the highest reviewed and original, and 3 being something we'll be able to figure out in the future once the hype cycle for the next game starts up, Xenoblade X is the most influential one to gaming as a whole, because if we don't get Monolith making an open world game on the Wii U, they don't get pulled to work on Breath of the Wild, and we don't get the version of Breath of the Wild that exists and completely change the gaming landscape. So, while X had the direct impact, that too wouldn't exist without Xenoblade 1. I personally find it weird when a game series that does do callbacks and fan service doesn't have the majority of those towards the first entry, unless it's like consistently one of the most disliked ones in the series. And it really felt like, despite Xenoblade 1 still obviously being a game most regarded as a masterpiece, was going down that route, just because the way the series had been progressing was rendering it irrelevant. Then Future Redeemed saw all of our concerns and was basically like, no, we retconned connections to other games in the series into Xenoblade 1 for a reason. Let's do something really cool with this. You think Alvis being Ontos was simply a way to recontextualize Xenoblade 3 into a story with something like the Zohar in it? Oh no, we're not actually done with that concept yet. You thought Tora made all the blueprints for Origin? No. He had something to reverse engineer. The core crystal of Ontos that Shulk found and was probably the first one to start to interpret. You thought that all of the DLC would be Xenoblade 2 related? No. We're not only including all that stuff we just talked about as additional lore in the DLC campaign, we're going to do something with Ontos and have that core act as a member of the Trinity processor and come in conflict with Numa and potentially Logos. Jury's still out on that one. We're going to bring back Alvis as a character and continue to do something based on the spark of humanity that was shown to them by Shulk. We are going to make the final boss of this game something from Xenoblade 1, attempting to do something based on Klaus and on the bigger context for his motivations and actions that we were given in 2. Oh, 3 of the founders are blood related to Rex, and a 4th is connected to him by bonds of mentorship? Yeah, that is true. However, one of the founders is blood related to Shulk. One of the founders is basically identical to what Rex did for House Cassini. And then the 7th founder is Riku, another Xenoblade 1 party member descendant who has connections with both Shulk and Melia. Riku's entire deal is that he's a big Xenoblade 1 reference. And yeah, there's an 8th main character who isn't one of the founders, who is also a returning character from Xenoblade 1. You're going to visit tons of Xenoblade 1 locations. The final boss theme is going to sound a lot like Zen's The Divine, and the design of the boss is going to draw inspiration primarily from Xenoblade 1 again alongside Xenogears, putting the beginning of the Xenoblade series alongside the genesis of Xeno as a whole. Shulk and A are given plenty of opportunities to reminisce on things that happened in the past in Xenoblade 1, and give hints about what happened in the future after the end of Future Connected that we didn't really get to see in Melia-related stuff, and is coming close to being equal to what we heard about Xenoblade 2's party. Shulk and Rex are united together, and they're given completely equal weight, treated with the same amount of respect, and put on the exact same pedestal because both of them deserve that. And even in the end, the final bit of assistance comes from the Kavesi console N, aiding in the fight against the Xenoblade 1 derived antagonist Alpha, and being the one to finally unlock Ouroboros. The ending even contains a referenced shot to the end of Xenoblade 1 in A paraphrasing something Alvis said so long ago. That bright future is still coming, and Xenoblade 1 is still an important foundation for it. If Definitive Edition was an update of Xenoblade 1, drawing from everything the developers had learned in the decades since its original release, Future Redeemed is a hint towards the future of the series, and also a love letter to Xenoblade 1, to the beginning of the Xenoblade world that we all love so much. And I will continue to talk about that world, the other Xeno worlds, and worlds that we might not have even seen yet. But that will have to wait until next time, and until then, this is Luxon, signing off.